a little bit here. I'm John G. Kruth, and I am the program chair for the upcoming conference for the Society for Scientific Exploration and the Parapsychological Association. I'm also the executive director of the Rhine Research Center in Durham, North Carolina, and co-founder of the Rhine Education Center and the education chair or education director for the Rhine Education Center that's sponsoring. But you don't need to hear more about me. I do research in parapsychology. I work within the field and help to coordinate people to get together, and that's what this conference is all about: connections. But I have a lot to talk about today. I don't know what made me think I could cover healing, PK, and subtle energies all in one 30-minute talk. I have a whole course on this that I teach at the Rhine Education Center, but I'm going to try to go through it quickly and give you guys an overview. My goal today is to provide terminology and let you know what you might be hearing about in the conference, because you're going to hear a lot about some of these topics. So let's get started here. And I'm going to start just by talking about what is PK and what is energy healing, and just give you a really quick introduction to the phenomena. Psychokinesis, telekinesis, PK, mind-matter interaction, all these different words. People use these words for so many different things. For my purposes today, they're all the same. We're talking about one thing here. You'll hear me using psychokinesis, PK, mind-matter interaction. I don't use the term telekinesis. Telekinesis is a term that kind of developed and was very popular when television was coming into vogue. And the whole idea behind telekinesis, the use of it, the concept is that there's a central broadcasting center that is affecting receiving units in different locations. And that was the idea of how telekinesis worked. It doesn't seem to work that way from all of our research that we've done. And so I consider this a theory-laden term, something that contains some obsolete theory within it. So I don't use that term. Other people you might hear using it for other purposes, but I tend to stick with PK, psychokinesis, or mind-matter interaction. So what is it? Well, it's a direct influence on physical systems that cannot entirely be accounted for by physical energies. Or another way of saying it is affecting objects without physically touching them or using any physical means to influence them. Now, why didn't I just say, well, you're intentionally affecting physical objects with the power of the mind? Because that's what a lot of people think about. Well, one of the reasons I didn't say that is that it's not always intentional. And so to give a good definition, we have to recognize there are some times it occurs unintentionally. Or what about using mental energies to project a force upon objects? Well, we don't know that they're mental energies. We don't recognize it. It's not clear that it comes from the mind. It's not clear that it's intentional. And the other thing we're talking about that says projecting a force on objects, when we measure it, we're not able to measure. We see the objects move at times or having an influence on them, but we haven't been able to measure a force on them. It's not clear that's what we're dealing with here. So I'm sticking with my definitions that I gave you first. Direct influence on physical systems that cannot entirely be accounted for by physical energies. So when you look in popular culture and in the media, you see many different representations of PK. You'll see poltergeists where you have chairs flying around the room. You'll see in the Matrix where spoons are bending. You'll see in Carrie where cars are flying up in the air. Yoda makes spaceships float and does a lot of other things as well. You see The Exorcist and people levitating in the air. All of these things, they're fun, they're interesting. I love these things. I watch them all the time. Not really what we see. When we look at PK in the lab, what it really looks like is they're typically small effects. We typically see very small visible objects or even microscopic objects that are being affected. For example, up there on the left, you see that little jar with a aluminum foil pinwheel in it. The pinwheel, people were able to move that pinwheel within the jar without touching it, without affecting it with any heat or light or anything else. We've really controlled these situations very carefully, and still people were able to cause those objects to move, stop, reverse direction, move the other way. So these small objects, no cars are floating around, but that's a pretty cool effect to see whenever no one's touching it and it's moving. We use other more complex ways to measure it as well. Spoon bending is something that often people consider a form of psychokinesis. We also have effects sometimes on electronics, but usually these effects that we see, they're inconsistent. People aren't doing them all the time. Now I say that, but I have to also say that I've been really lucky in the research I've done. I've had participants come to my laboratory who are extremely consistent. It's really unusual. There are many people in the field of parapsychology who have never seen psychokinesis or PK happen. They've never seen it. And they doubt whether it's real or not. But in my lab, it happens. It happens to the point that I can say that I have some people who I can see them doing it consistently. But typically, it's a very inconsistent phenomenon. It doesn't always happen. You can't rely on it. In addition, some effects that we see can only be measured as statistical anomalies. What you would expect to happen from chance, something different occurs. And it happens enough that we can say it looks like there's an effect here. So what's going on? What are these things? Well, when we talk about PK, we use two different terms, and you're going to hear these terms within the conference in next week. One is macro PK, and the other is micro PK. Now, macro PK is something that affecting objects that you can actually see. You're usually affecting larger objects. It's visible effects. Things like having the wheel spin within a jar. You see it happening. You can see what's going on. If someone were to cause a pencil to roll across a table, that would be a visible effect, something you could actually see. Then you have micro PK, which is affecting very small or microscopic objects, things you can't see with the naked eye. Oftentimes, it might involve affecting electronics. How can electronics be affected without us touching them or without us having, but sometimes they are affected. And having effects on electronics would be a form of micro PK. In addition, there's some effects that you can only see statistically. For example, there's quantum events that occur. And typically in random number generators, we have quantum events. But you can't really see that there's a difference between what you see and whether is there really something there. And only by looking at the statistics and analyzing it over a longer period of time can you tell if there is truly a PK effect occurring there. Now, I say we have these two different words, and we do use these words, macro PK and micro PK, and they sound really different. One is objects you can see. The other one is something so small that you have to look at statistics or use a microscope. These are not distinct and separate phenomena. We use them in order to explain what we're looking at in the laboratory and what we see when we're doing our research. But it's really, we see a spectrum. There are some phenomena that you can't really classify as micro PK or macro PK. It kind of goes on this continuum here. For example, if I'm rolling a dice and I'm able to roll the dice and make the numbers I want to come up, you can say, well, that's macro PK. You can see the dice, you can see the numbers coming out. But actually, I'm not like making the dice float in the air and kind of move around and go back to the table. That would be macro PK. But when I roll the dice, there's actually a lot of very small forces that are causing the die to move in a certain way and maybe causing that number